A chilling warning. The story of Sylvia Likens is one of the most tragic and horrifying criminal cases in U.S. history. Here is a summary of what happened. Sylvia Likens and her younger sister Jenny were sent to live temporarily with Gertrude Banishevsky, a single mother in Indianapolis in 1965. Initially promised care akin to that of Banishevsky's own children, their stay quickly turned into a nightmare. Haunted by financial struggles and personal conflicts, Banishevsky descended into cruelty and violence. She began to torture Sylvia, using brutal punishments such as beatings, starvation, and psychological torment. These acts were even heard by neighbors, yet no one intervened. During her ordeal, Sylvia suffered severe injuries and was ultimately tortured to death in the upstairs of the house where she lived with Banishevsky and her family. She was neglected and left to die. Following police intervention and investigation, Gertrude Banishevsky and her accomplices were arrested and convicted of murder. The case shook the community and raised profound questions about crime and family violence. This heartbreaking account underscores the consequences of domestic violence and moral decay, making Sylvia Likens' story one of the most poignant tragedies in U.S. criminal history. The parents of 16-year-old Sylvia work in the festival's organizing team, so they often have to travel everywhere in the United States. The reason she had to do this manual work was because Sylvia's father, Mr. Lester Likens, only had an 8th grade education and shouldered the responsibility of raising 5 children. Jenny was a quiet child and was raised as a newborn. Meanwhile, Sylvia is more spontaneous and is often called by the nickname Cookie. Even though she lost her tooth ring, Sylvia is still considered beautiful and beautiful. In July 1965, Lester continued to travel to festivals while his wife was in prison for robbery. Sylvia's 2 younger brothers, Danny and Benny, were left in the care of their grandparents. Without many options, Mr. Lester had to give the 2 sisters, Sylvia and Jenny, to a family acquaintance, Gertrude Banishevsky, to help take care of the children. Gertrude's situation was no different from Lester's, as she had 7 children. She earned a little money by pressing clothes for her neighbors. Mrs. Gertrude experienced many unhappy marriages and was abused by many abusive husbands. This led to severe depression and caused Mrs. Gertrude to take high levels of medication. Obviously, she did not have the conditions to take care of Sylvia and her sisters. But Mr. Lester's family had no other choice. Lester told Gertrude that she could punish his children if they did wrong. It is known that the salary Mrs. Gertrude received for taking care of Sylvia and Jenny was $20/week. During the first 2 weeks, the 2 sisters Sylvia were treated quite well, although Gertrude's 17-year-old eldest daughter Paula gently confronted her. But then the next week, Mr. Lester sent money to Mrs. Gertrude to expire. "I've been taking care of the server for 2 weeks and haven't received any money," Mrs. Gertrude said while hitting the 2 sisters Sylvia. She pulled Sylvia into the room and closed the door. Jenny sat outside and could only hear the noise of her sister's pain. Mr. Lester's money arrived the next day, but the attack had only just begun. The next time, Mrs. Gertrude began to beat the 2 sisters Sylvia more, regardless of day or night. That time, she used a thick wooden stick and thick leather to beat the 2 children. Sometimes when Mrs. Gertrude was tired or exhausted, her eldest daughter Paula would take her mother's place and abuse Sylvia and Jenny. Gradually, Sylvia became the only subject to be beaten. Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing her things and then used fire to burn the young girl's first fingers. Not stopping there, this evil woman also forced Sylvia to eat so many free hot dogs that she vomited. Next, Mrs. Gertrude asked Sylvia to eat the food she had just vomited as punishment. Mrs. Gertrude then allowed and even encouraged her children to take turns beating the 2 sisters Sylvia. From then on, the children of this family saw Sylvia as a punching bag, so they could practice martial arts, hitting the young girl into the wall and onto the ground. We looked at Sylvia's flesh as brutally to drug her, pushed her down the stairs, cut her skin, and then rubbed salt into the victim's red wound. After the beatings, Sylvia was purified in a barrel of hot water. As time passed, the attacks became more vicious, hitting Sylvia's genitals. The young girl fought so much that she couldn't go to the bathroom on her own. When Sylvia urinated on the bed, Gertrude decided she was no longer fit to live with her family. As a result, Sylvia was locked in the basement without food or a toilet. No matter how many things she received, Mrs. Gertrude could not stop. She continued to recruit neighborhood children to join her assault army. Gertrude lied to her daughter that Sylvia had violated her. This made the daughter angry and beat Sylvia. Young girl Anna Cisco was once recruited by Mrs. Gertrude to abuse Sylvia. Mrs. Gertrude created a story that Sylvia said Anna's mother had sex with many different men for money. At that time, Anna did not misunderstand and went to Gertrude's house to bomb Sylvia. Among them was a neighbor teenager named Richard Hobbs, who, shaking hands with Mrs. Gertrude's daughter Marie, used a hot needle to write ugly words on Sylvia's stomach. One time, her sister Sylvia wanted to go to Mrs. Gertrude's house to visit her children, but was refused. While Sylvia was imprisoned in the basement, Jenny snuck down many times to give her sister food. A neighbor reported work to a public health care operation. This person went to Gertrude's house to check, but could not find Sylvia because the young girl was being held in the basement and assumed that nothing unusual was happening here. Mrs. Gertrude then convinced the other nurse to believe that the two sisters, Sylvia, were no longer at her house. The surrounding neighbors were said to know about the abuse of Sylvia, and they even witnessed Paula beating her twice, but did not dare to report to the police because he feared for his family's safety. Jenny was threatened and beaten by Gertrude and her mother to prevent her from going to the authorities and denouncing her. Just like that, Sylvia silently endured the endless beatings. "I'm about to die," Sylvia said that to Jenny 3 days before she died. Mrs. Gertrude also sensed something was wrong, so she forced Sylvia to write a note saying that she had left home when she met a group of boys, had sex with them, and was beaten by them until her body was seriously injured. Later, Sylvia accidentally heard Mrs. Gertrude's plan and told her children that she intended to take her to the forest and leave her to die there. Sylvia used all her strength to escape. She ran to the main door but was caught by Mrs. Gertrude. With the help of neighbor teenager Coy Hubbard, Mrs. Gertrude beat Sylvia until the young girl lost consciousness. Sylvia died on October 26, 1965 from cerebral hemorrhage, shock, and malnutrition. After 3 months of torture and starvation, the young girl was paralyzed and could barely move. When the police arrived at the house, Mrs. Gertrude declared that Sylvia had gone into the woods with a group of boyfriends and was tattooed on her body and beaten to death. At this time, Jenny took the opportunity to say to the police officer, "Please take me out of here. I will tell everything." Police then arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, John Banaszewski, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard for murder. Neighbors who participated in beating Sylvia, Mike Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Cisco, were also arrested for causing bodily injury to others. They put all the blame on Mrs. Gertrude, saying they were pressured by her to make such a mistake. On May 19, 1966, Miss Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for the eldest daughter, Paula also received the same sentence as her mother for second-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Banaszewski Jr. were convicted of manslaughter and received a prison sentence of 2 to 21 years considering they were minors. Paula was acquitted after 8 years of serving her sentence before moving to Iowa to live with a new name. In 2012, Paula was expelled from school after the school received a tip-off that she was involved in the death of 16-year-old girl Sylvia Likens. In fact, Miss Gertrude only had to serve 20 years in prison and was acquitted in 1985. Jenny and a group of people organized a protest against this decision, but it was ineffective. 5 years after being released from prison, Mrs. Gertrude died of lung cancer. After all, Jenny doesn't blame her parents for what happened to her sister. She believes that her mother's only mistake was placing her trust in an evil woman like Gertrude. We went to England together to hear the same story, also involved child murder, but was committed by a girl when she was 11 years old. Mary Bell, the child-faced villain. The 11-year-old girl who brutally murdered and mutilated victims. The notorious child killer of England murdered and dismembered 2 victims, 4-year-old Martin Brown and 3-year-old Brian Howe, becoming a nightmare for many in the land of mist. Many of us always believe that children have pure, innocent souls. However, sometimes the story is not as people think. The name Mary Flora Bell, the 11-year-old child villain who strangled 2 children to death in Scotswood, Newcastle, England, has led people to believe in child-faced villains. Mary Bell was born into an unhappy family and did not receive love from her parents. Her father, Billy Bell, had been in prison and was rarely at home. He often left Mary in the care of relatives. In fact, many people did not know if he was Mary's biological father, as her mother, Betty Bell, was a prostitute with a sadistic disorder. She had also sold her daughter and forced her to serve clients from the age of 4. Mary grew up exhibiting many signs of aggression and cruelty. She frequently tortured animals and massaged other children in the playground by choking them. Family members also reported that Betty, Mary's mother, had attempted to kill her daughter multiple times and made the incidents look like accidents, such as when Mary fell from a window or accidentally ingested a large number of sleeping pills. At school, Mary was a mischievous, disruptive child, a habitual liar showing signs of mental illness from a young age. She often abused and bullied her peers. Parents of other children at the school had reported Mary to the police after she choked their children. However, the police did nothing. Despite her violent tendencies, Mary was quite intelligent and had an admirer, Norma Bell. The 13-year-old girl described herself as rather plain and not as clever as Mary. According to police reports, Mary Bell committed her first crime entirely on her own. Although Mary's friend Norma Joyce Bell was also investigated, the court later found her innocent in the first case. On May 25, 1968, 2 boys playing on the second floor of an abandoned house discovered the body of 4-year-old Martin Brown. The children were accompanied by Mary and Norma Bell. When the police arrived at the scene, they noticed the suspicious behavior of the 2 girls. The cause of death was not immediately clear, and it was initially concluded that Martin Brown had accidentally ingested sleeping pills from an old bottle found nearby. However, in reality, the boy had been strangled to death by Mary Bell. Because her grip was not strong enough to leave any marks on his neck, the police deemed it an accident. 4 days later, Mary Bell went to Martin's house to ask to see him. Martin's mother, speaking in a voice full of sorrow, informed her that the boy had passed away.
"Yes, I know he's dead, but I want to see him in his coffin,"
Mary replied when Martin's mother explained. On May 26, 1968, Norma Bell's father found Mary strangling his daughter. He entered the room, slapped Mary, and sent her home. A few days later, a local nursery school was disrupted with supplies and other items thrown around the floor. Mary and Norma Bell had sneaked in and left messages on the wall. "Martin was killed by me, you bastards." However, the police dismissed this as a prank and did not investigate or question anyone. On July 31st, 1968, another boy was found dead from asphyxiation. This time, the victim was 3-year-old Brian Howe. Both Mary and Norma were present at the scene when the police arrived. Mary blamed Norma for the cuts on the boy's body made with a razor blade. The police believed that Mary Bell had returned to carve an N on Brian's stomach, but then changed it to an M. The poor 3-year-old boy had part of his hair cut off, his legs slashed, and his genitals mutilated and cut off with a razor blade. Mary wanted Brian's brother Pat to discover his brother's body and be terrified. However, she did not accomplish her goal as the police found the body in the evening. When asked why she killed Brian, Mary said, "Brian Howe doesn't have a mother, so no one will miss him." The case caused the local residents to become fearful and worried for their children's safety. The police interviewed all the children in the area to identify any suspects. When they interviewed Mary Bell, they knew they had found the murderer. On December 5, 1968, Mary and Norma Bell were brought to trial in connection with the deaths of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. In light of the chilling story of Mary Bell, it is imperative to recognize the importance of protecting children from individuals who exhibit violent tendencies. The tragic events that unfolded in Scotswood, Newcastle, serve as a stark reminder of what can happen when the warning signs of aggression and cruelty are overlooked. Here are some steps to ensure the safety and well-being of children. Please follow us. We have many more interesting stories to send to you. Thank you for following and supporting us to create even better stories.